case of Air France Flight 447. It was a plane that, for all intents and purposes, for a long time, seemed like it just fell out of the sky mid-flight. I got a pair of sugar tongs to hold my microphone with. See? Focus on the tongs. They're fancy. I was holding it like this, just with my hand, but it kind of got tiring, so that's why I got the tongs. I was hoping it would be easier. Yeah. So, I guess it came before the Malaysia flight that also just disappeared. But yeah, it was a pretty big deal. And I wouldn't recommend listening to this video if you're flying anytime soon. So, Air France Flight 447 was a scheduled international passenger flight from Rio, Brazil to Paris, France. The plane in the accident was a 4-year-old Airbus, so not a Boeing, A330-200. Air France received it in 2005, and it got a major overhaul, whatever that means for a plane, I guess a renovation, in 2009, which is the year of the accident. At the time of the accident, it had been flown about 18,870 hours total, and I tried to find statistics on, like, what a lot of miles is for a plane, because, you know, for a car, like, anything over 100,000 is kind of a lot, but, yeah, I guess every flight really is either in the hundreds or the thousands of miles. So if it's flying like, I don't know, 2,000 miles every flight, which is probably a lot, honestly, like, I don't really know, but then I guess it would be, well, if it was 2,000 miles, then would 18,000 only have been like 9 flights? That doesn't seem right. 9 times 2 is 18, right? I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah, but I guess if every flight's 1,000 miles, then it's only flown 18 flights. That doesn't seem right either. I don't know, I guess it doesn't really matter, but I was just curious if it was like a really old plane, or if it was like a relatively new plane. So, anyway, on May 31st, 2009, the plane took off from Rio de Janeiro, Galeão International Airport. I don't know how to pronounce the A with the little tilde thing over it. But yeah, it departed at 7:29 p.m. Brazilian Standard Time and was scheduled to arrive at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport at 11:03 a.m. Central European Summer Time the next day, after about 10 hours and 34 minutes of flying. At only 3 hours and 6 minutes into the flight, though, voice contact with the plane was lost. On the flight, there were 216 passengers, 3 crew, and 9 cabin crew, of which there were 126 men, 82 women, and 8 children, including 1 infant. So on this plane, there were 3 pilots flying. There was the pilot in command, who was a 58-year-old Captain Marc Dubois, who had joined Air France in February 1988, and had 10,988 flying hours, of which 6,258 were as captain, including 1,700 hours on the Airbus A330. He'd carried out 16 rotations in the South American sector since arriving in the A3300, A340 division in 2007. So he was an experienced guy. The crew's relief co-pilot in the left seat was 37-year-old First Officer David Robert, who had joined Air France in July 1998 and had 6,547 flying hours, of which 4,479 were on the Airbus A330. He'd done 39 rotations in the South America sector since arriving in the A330, A340 division in 2002. Robert had graduated from École Nationale de l'Aviation Civile. I can't pronounce it in French. One of the elite grandes écoles. That's Spanish pronunciation, but whatever. I don't know what that is. I guess it's a good flying school. And he had transitioned from a pilot to a management job at the airline's operations center, so he wasn't actively working as a pilot anymore at that time, and the reason he was on the flight was just to maintain his flying credentials. The co-pilot in the right seat, 32-year-old First Officer Pierre-Cedric Bonin, had joined Air France in October 2003 and had 2,936 flight hours, of which 807 hours Isabel, a physics teacher, was also on the plane. The majority of the passengers were French, Brazilian, or German citizens. The passengers included business and holiday travelers. And there were also quite a few important people on this flight. There was Prince Pedro Luis of Orleans Braganza, third in succession to the abolished throne of Brazil and grandnephew of Grand Duke John of Luxembourg, who was going back home to Luxembourg after visiting his relatives in Rio. There was Giambattista Lenzi, member of the Regional Council of Trentino Alto Adige, which is the legislative assembly of the autonomous region of Trentino Alto Adige, so it's an Italian regional council in northeast Italy, basically. Silvio Barbato, composer and former conductor of the symphony orchestras of the Claudio Santoro National Theatre in Brasilia and the Rio de Janeiro Municipal Theatre. He was en route to Kyiv for engagements there. There was Octavio Augusto Seva Antunes, professor of chemistry and pharmaceuticals at the Federal University of Rio. There was Fatma, it's a Turkish name. I'm gonna try, but no guarantees. Fatma Sarıncıpoğlu, Turkish classical harpist and academic of Anadolu University in Turkey. She was going home via Paris after performing at the 4th Rio Harp Festival. Isabella Maria Furtado Kessler, professor of German studies at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And finally, Pablo Dreyfus from Argentina, a campaigner for controlling illegal arms and the illegal drugs trade. So the Airbus A330 is designed to be flown by 2 pilots, but the 13-hour duty time, which is the total flight duration, as well as pre-flight preparation required for the Rio-Paris route, was longer than the 10 hours permitted before a pilot has to take a break, as dictated by Air France's procedures. So to comply with that, Flight 447 was crewed by 3 pilots, a captain and 2 first officers, so that each pilot could take a break in the A330's rest cabin behind the cockpit. As was common practice, Captain Dubois sent First Officer Robert for the first rest period, and planned on taking the second break himself. At 1:55 UTC, I don't really know what UTC is. Universal Time C. He woke up First Officer Robert and said, quote, "He's going to take my place." After watching the briefing between the 2 co-pilots, the captain left the cockpit to rest at 2:01 UTC. At 2:06 UTC, Bonin warned the cabin crew that they were about to enter an area of turbulence, and about 2 or 3 minutes later, the plane encountered icing conditions. The cockpit voice recorder recorded sounds that could have been hail hitting the outside of the plane, and ice crystals started to build up in the pitot tubes, which are on the front of the plane's nose, and measure airspeed. Bonin turned the plane slightly to the left and decreased its speed from Mach 0.82, which is 629 miles per hour, to Mach 0.8, which is 613 miles per hour, which was the recommended speed to go through the turbulence. The engine anti-icing system was also turned on. So that kind of weather in the Mid-Atlantic area was apparently pretty normal for the time of year, and included a broad band of thunderstorms along the intertropical convergence zone. A meteorological analysis of the area surrounding the flight path showed a mesoscale convective system extending to an altitude of around 50,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean before Flight 447 disappeared, and in the last hour of the flight they so I guess it was like tilting to the right. And Bonin reacted by deflecting his side stick to the left. One consequence of the change to alternate law 2 was an increase in the plane's sensitivity to roll, which I think is like the side-by-side motion. And Bonin overdid his correction to the left. Because of that, he spent the next 30 seconds with the plane rolling back and forth between left and right as he adjusted to the altered handling characteristics of the plane. At the same time, he abruptly pulled back on his side stick, raising the nose. So, I'm not sure about this totally, but it seems like Airbuses, instead of having like the yoke that like you'd normally see on a plane, like that weird steering wheel thing, it seems like they just have a stick. I don't like that. I think I would want to fly with a yoke if I was a pilot. Maybe that's just old-fashioned of me, though. Anyway, at the same time as he was rolling side to side, he abruptly pulled back on his side stick, raising the nose. That was unnecessary and excessive under the circumstances, and it caused the plane's stall warning to briefly go off twice because the angle of attack tolerance was exceeded, and the plane's indicated airspeed dropped sharply from 315 miles per hour to 60 miles per hour. Now remember, originally they were going 613 miles an hour. So between then and when the autopilot turned off, or between when the autopilot turned off and at this time, they lost half their speed, and then they lost another 300 miles per hour, basically. The plane's angle of attack increased even more, and the plane started to climb above its designated cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. During the ascent, the plane's vertical climb speed was well over the typical rate of climb for the Airbus A330. For the Airbus A330, which usually ascends at rates no greater than 2,000 feet per minute, or about 22 miles per hour. At its fastest, the plane's peak vertical speed was close to 7,000 feet per minute, or 80 miles an hour, which happened as Bonin brought the rolling movements under control. So, they're only supposed to ascend at like 22 miles per hour, and at this point they were ascending at 80 miles an hour. At 2:10 UTC, after displaying incorrectly for half a minute, the left side instruments recorded a sharp rise in airspeed to 257 miles per hour from 60, as did the integrated standby instrument system 33 seconds later. On the right side instruments were not recorded by the flight data recorder. The icing event had only lasted for just over a minute, but Bonin continued to make nose-up inputs. The trimmable horizontal stabilizer, which is like the horizontal part of the tail, moved from 3 degrees to 13 degrees nose up in about 1 minute, and remained in the 13 degrees position until the end of the flight. I can't imagine what that would feel like as a passenger ascending at a speed like that, and at such a steep angle. because of that, exceeding this angle should be avoided during normal flight operations. By the time Captain Dubois got there, the angle of attack was 40 degrees, and the plane had descended to 35,000 feet from 38,000, with the engines running at almost 100% N1, which is another confusing flight term, and I guess it means full throttle. I don't really know. The stall warning stopped because all airspeed indications were now considered invalid by the plane's computer because of the high angle of attack. The plane had its nose above the horizon, but was descending steeply instead of rising. About 20 seconds later, Bonin decreased the plane's pitch slightly, and the airspeed indications became valid again, so the stall warning started sounding again. It then sounded intermittently for the remainder of the flight, stopping only when the pilots increased the plane's nose-up pitch. From there until the end of the flight, the angle of attack never dropped below 35 degrees, and it's not supposed to even be above 18 degrees, let alone double that. From the time the plane stalled until its impact with the ocean, the engines were primarily developing either 100% N1 or TOGA thrust, which is takeoff go-around thrust, though they were briefly pulled down to about 50% N1 on 2 occasions. The engines always responded to commands and were developing in excess of 100% N1 when the flight ended. So, in other words, I guess the engines weren't the problem. They were doing their thing. The engines were engineering. Robert responded to Dubois by saying, quote, "We've lost all control of the airplane. We don't understand anything. We've tried everything." Apparently everything just means putting the nose up higher and higher. I shouldn't say that, but still. Soon after this, Robert said to himself, "Climb," 4 consecutive times. Bonin heard this and replied, quote, "But I've been at maximum nose up for a while." When Captain Dubois heard that, he realized Bonin was causing the stall and shouted, "No, no, no, don't climb. No, no, no." When Robert heard this, he told Bonin to give him control of the plane, and Bonin initially obliged. At that point, though, the plane was too low to recover from the stall. Robert pushed his side stick forward to try to regain lift to get out of the stall. But shortly after that, the ground proximity warning system sounded a sink rate alarm, followed by pull-up alarms. In response, Bonin, without informing his colleagues, pulled his side stick all the way back again and said, quote, "We're going to crash. This can't be true, but what's happening?" The last recording on the voice recorder was Dubois saying, 10 degrees pitch attitude. Both flight recorders stopped working at 2:14 UTC, 3 hours and 45 minutes after takeoff. At that point, the plane's ground speed was recorded as 123 miles per hour, and the plane was descending at 10,912 feet per minute, which is 124 miles per hour of vertical speed. Its pitch was 16.2 degrees nose up, with a roll angle of 5.3 degrees to the left. During its descent, the plane had turned more than 180 degrees to the right, to a compass heading of 270 degrees. The plane remained stalled during the entire 3-minute 30-second descent from 38,000 feet. They hit the ocean belly first at a speed of 75 miles per hour, comprising vertical and horizontal components of 24 miles per hour, 124 miles per hour, and 123 miles per hour, respectively. I don't really understand the horizontal speed thing. Like, the vertical speed thing, sure. Like, they were going down. But what is horizontal speed? Anyway, all 228 passengers and crew on board died on impact from extreme trauma, and the plane was destroyed. Throughout the whole time, from the autopilot turning off until the plane hit the water, an automated system was transmitting messages about what was going on. I'm not exactly sure who the messages transmitted to, but Air France's A330s have a communication system called the Plane Communications Addressing and Reporting System, abbreviated as ACARS, which transmits data messages via VHF, very high frequency, or satellite. ACARS can be used by the plane's onboard computers to send messages automatically, and Flight 447 transmitted a position report about every 10 minutes. Along with the routine position reports, Flight 477's centralized maintenance system sent a series of ACARS between the three independent air data systems. At 2:13 UTC, a fault message for the flight management guidance in an envelope computer was sent. One of the two final messages transmitted at 2:14 UTC was a warning referring to the air data reference system. The other advisory was a cabin vertical speed warning, indicating that the plane was descending at a high rate. So, obviously I just told you what happened, but at the time those warnings were pretty much the only thing initially that investigators had to go off of to explain what exactly happened to this flight. So at around 2:20 a.m. UTC, on June 1st, Flight 447 was expected to pass from Brazilian airspace into Senegalese airspace, and then into Cape Verdean airspace about an hour and 20 minutes later. By 4 o'clock, when the plane hadn't made contact with either Senegal or Cape Verde air traffic controllers, the controller in Senegal tried to make contact with the plane. They got no response, so the controller asked the crew of another Air France flight to try and contact Flight 447, which was also unsuccessful. After a few more unanswered attempts to contact the flight, an aerial search for the plane started on both sides of the Atlantic. A Brazilian Air Force plane from the archipelago of Fernando de Noronha and a French reconnaissance plane from Dakar, Senegal, led the search, along with a Casca 235 maritime patrol plane from Spain and a U.S. Navy Lockheed Martin P-3 Orion anti-submarine warfare and maritime patrol plane. It's a long name. Air France established a crisis center at Terminal D2D, for the 60 to 70 relatives and friends who arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport to pick up arriving passengers, but many of the passengers on Flight 447 were connecting to other destinations worldwide, so they couldn't get to everyone. In the days that followed, Air France contacted close to 2,000 people who were related to or friends of the victims. By early afternoon on June 1st, officials with Air France and the French government had already assumed that the plane was lost with no survivors. An Air France spokesperson told L'Express that, quote, no hope for survivors remained, and French President Nicolas Sarkozy announced almost no chance existed for anyone to have survived. And they were right about that, of course, but damn, don't sugarcoat it or anything, right? On June 2nd at 15:20 UTC, a Brazilian Air Force Embraer R99A spotted wreckage and signs of oil, possibly jet fuel, strewn along a 3-mile band, 400 miles northeast of Fernando de Noronha Island, near the St. Peter and St. Paul archipelago. The wreckage included a plane seat, an orange buoy, a barrel, and, quote, white pieces and electrical conductors. Electronical. That's not a word. Later that day, after meeting with relatives of the Brazilians on the plane, Brazilian Defense Minister Nelson Jobim announced that the Air Force believed the wreckage was from Flight 447. Brazilian Vice President José Alencar, acting as president since Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was out of the country, declared 3 days of official mourning. The same day, 2 French Navy vessels were en route to the suspected crash site. Other ships sent to the site included the French research vessel Pourquoi Pas, equipped with 2 mini-submarines able to descend to 20,000 feet, since the area of the Atlantic in which the plane went down was thought to be as deep as 15,400 feet. On June 3rd, the first Brazilian Navy ship reached the area in which the first debris was spotted, out of 5 total that were sent. Early on June 6, 2009, 5 days after Flight 447 disappeared, 2 male bodies, the first to be recovered from the crashed so, as the number of personnel mobilized by the Brazilian military exceeded 1,100. 15 planes, including 2 helicopters, were devoted to the search mission. The Brazilian Air Force Embraer R99 flew for more than 100 hours and electronically scanned more than 1 million square kilometers of ocean. Other planes involved in the search scanned visually 120,000 square miles of ocean and were used to direct Navy vessels involved in the recovery effort. By June 16, 2009, 50 bodies had been recovered from a wide area of the ocean. They were transported to shore by various boats, and then some of the bodies after that were transported by air to Recife for identification. Pathologists identified all 50 bodies recovered from the crash site, including that of the captain, by using dental records and fingerprints. The search teams logged the time and location of every find in a database, which by the time the search ended on June 26th, cataloged 640 items of debris from the plane. On June 5, 2009, a French nuclear submarine was sent to the crash zone, arriving in the area 5 days later, with its mission being to assist in the search for the missing flight recorders or black boxes that were expected to probably be pretty deep down in the ocean. The submarine would use its sonar to listen for the ultrasonic signal emitted by the black box's pingers, covering 13 square miles per day, along with a mini-sub that could go down to the ocean floor. The French submarines were helped by 2 U.S. underwater audio devices capable of picking up signals at a depth of 20,000 feet. My camera battery's about to die. Okay, I got a new battery. So the French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, or the BEA, Chief Paul-Louis Arslanian, said that he was not optimistic about finding the black boxes, since they might have been under as much as 9,800 feet of water. And the terrain under that part of the ocean was very rugged. Investigators were hoping to find the plane's lower aft section, since that was where the recorders were located. Although France had never recovered a flight recorder from that deep before, there was precedent for the operation, since in 1988, an independent contractor recovered the cockpit voice recorder of South African Airways Flight 295 from a depth of 16,100 feet in a search area between 80 and 250 square nautical miles. The Air France flight recorders were filled with water-activated acoustic underwater locator beacons, or pingers, which should have remained active for at least 30 days, giving the searchers that much time to locate the origin of the signals. France requested 2 towered pinger locator hydrophones from the United States Navy to help find the plane, and the French nuclear submarine and 2 French contracted ships towing the U.S. Navy listening devices trawled a search area with a radius of 15 miles, centered on the plane's last known position, but by mid-July, recovery of the black boxes still had not been announced. The finite beacon battery life meant that, as the time since the crash went on, the likelihood of location decreased. In late July, the search for the black boxes entered its second phase, with a French research vessel resuming the search using a towed sonar array. The second phase of the search ended on August 20th without finding wreckage within a 40-mile radius of the last position. The third phase of the search for the recorders lasted from April 2nd until May 24th, 2010, and was carried out by 2 ships, the Anne Candies and the Seabed Worker. The Anne Candies towed a U.S. Navy sonar array, while the Seabed Worker operated 3 robot submarine AUV Abyss. Air France and Airbus jointly funded the third phase of the search, which covered an area of 2,400 square miles, mostly to the north and northwest of the plane's last known position. The search area had been drawn up by oceanographers from France, Russia, currents in the mid-Atlantic in the days immediately after the crash. A smaller area to the southwest was also searched based on a reanalysis of sonar recordings made by the French nuclear submarine during the initial search. The third phase of the search ended on May 24, 2010, still without any success, though the PEA said that the search nearly covered the whole area drawn up by investigators. In July 2010, the US-based research consultancy Metron Inc. was hired to draw up a probability map of where to focus the search, based on prior probabilities from flight data and local condition reports, combined with the results from the previous searches. Phase 4 of the search operation started close to the plane's last known position, which was identified by Metron's study as being the most likely resting place of Flight 447. Within a week of resuming the search operation on April 3, 2011, a team led by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, operating full ocean depth autonomous underwater vehicles owned by the Waite Institute, discovered a large portion of the debris field from Flight 447 using side-scan sonar. More debris and bodies still trapped in the partly intact remains of the plane's fuselage were at a depth of 13,060 feet. The debris was found lying in a relatively flat and silty area of the ocean floor, as opposed to the extremely mountainous topography originally believed to be Flight 447's final resting place. Other items found were engines, wing parts, and landing gear. The debris field was described as quite compact, measuring 660 by 1,970 feet, and a short distance north of where pieces of wreckage had been recovered previously, suggesting that the plane hit the water largely intact. The French Ecology and Transportation stated that the bodies and wreckage would be brought to the surface and taken to France for examination and identification, and the French government chartered a ship to recover the flight recorders from the wreckage. An American Remora 600 remotely operated vehicle and operations crew from Phoenix International experience in the recovery of planes for the United States Navy were on board that ship that was going out to recover things. The ship arrived at the crash site on April 26th, and during its first dive, the Remora 6000, I think I said 600 before, but it's 6000, found the flight data recorder chassis, although without the crash survivable memory unit. On May 1st, the memory unit was found and lifted on board by the ROV, the remotely operated vehicle, the Remora 6000. The plane's cockpit voice recorder was found on May 2nd, 2011, and was raised and brought on board the boat the following day. On May 7th, the flight recorders under judicial seal were taken aboard a French naval patrol boat for transfer at the port of Cheyenne. From there, they were transferred by air to the PEA's office in Le Bourget, near Paris, for data download and analysis. One engine and the avionics bay containing onboard computers had also been raised. On May 15th, all the data from both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder had been downloaded, and the data was analyzed over the following weeks. Between May 5th and June 3rd, 2011, 104 bodies were recovered from the wreckage, bringing the total number of bodies to 154. The search ended with the remaining 74 bodies still not having been recovered. The French authorities opened 2 investigations into this crash. A criminal investigation for manslaughter was opened on June 5, 2009, under the supervision of investigating magistrate Sylvie Zimmerman for the Paris High Court. The judge gave the investigation to the National Gendarmerie, I don't know what that is, which would contact it through its Aerial Transportation Division and its Forensic Research Institute. As part of the criminal investigation, the DGSE, the External French Intelligence Agency, so I guess the French CIA, right, examined the names of passengers on board for any possible links to terrorist groups. In March 2011, a French judge filed preliminary manslaughter charges against Air outside. But yeah, later on, it seems like they were in fact aware of the problem with the pitot tubes freezing, which is what caused the entire crash in the first place. And it seems like they really did choose to do nothing about it, so I don't understand why those charges were dropped, because that was definitely true. Or it seems that it was definitely true anyway. So the case against Airbus was dropped on July 22nd, the same year as it was filed. The case against Air France was dropped in September 2019 when magistrates said, quote, there were not enough grounds to prosecute. However, in 2021, a public prosecutor in Paris requested to have Airbus and Air France tried in a court of law. In April, it was announced that both companies would be prosecuted over the crash. Lawyers for Airbus stated that they would lodge an immediate appeal against the decision. The trial opened on October 10th, 2022, with Airbus and Air France both being charged with involuntary manslaughter. Both companies pleaded not guilty to the charges. On December 7th, the prosecutors announced that they would not seek conviction of either company for manslaughter, as they were unable to prove them guilty, and recommended acquitting both companies. Families and friends of the victims were outraged by the decision, obviously. On April 7th, 2023, Airbus and Air France were both acquitted of manslaughter. On June 20th, 2009, Air France announced that each victim's family would be paid roughly 17,500 euros in initial compensation, which isn't very much. A technical investigation was started with the goal of enhancing the safety of future flights. The PEA participated in the investigation, as a representative for the country of manufacture of the Airbus, along with the Brazilian Air Force's Aeronautical Accident Investigation and Prevention Center, the German Federal Bureau of Plane Accident Investigation, the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, and of course the US National Transportation Safety Board. The NTSB became involved as the representative of the state of manufacture of the General Electric turbine engines installed on the plane, and the other representatives could supply important information. The People's Republic of China, Croatia, Hungary, Republic of Ireland, Italy, Lebanon, Morocco, Norway, South Korea, Russia, South Africa, and Switzerland all appointed observers, since citizens of those countries were on board the flight. On June 5th, 2009, the PEA cautioned against premature speculation as to the cause of the crash. At the time, the investigation had established only two facts: the weather near the plane's planned route included significant convective cells of the equatorial regions, and the speeds measured by the three pitot tubes differed from each other during the last few minutes of the flight. On July 2nd, 2009, the PEA released an intermediate report which described all known facts and a summary of the visual examination of the rudder and the other parts of the plane that had been recovered at that time, which showed the airliner was likely to have struck the surface of the sea in a normal flight attitude, which is like flat, belly down, with a high rate of descent. No signs of any fires or explosions were found, and the airliner did not break up in flight. The report also stresses that the PEA had not had access to the post-mortem reports of the bodies that had been recovered at the time of writing. On May 18th, 2011, the head of the investigation further stated no major malfunction of the plane had been found so far in the data from the flight data recorder, but that minor malfunctions had not been ruled out. In the minutes before its disappearance, the plane's onboard system sent a number of messages via the ACARS, indicating disagreement in the indicated airspeed readings. A spokesperson for the PEA claimed, quote, the airspeed of the plane was unclear to the pilots, and on June 4th, 2009, Airbus issued an accident information telex. I don't know what a telex is. To operators of all its planes, reminding pilots of the recommended abnormal and emergency procedures to be taken in the case of unreliable airspeed indication. The French Transport Minister Dominique Bisset 2008 and March 2009, 9 incidences involving temporary loss of airspeed. Indication appeared in the air safety reports for Air France's A330, A340 fleet. All occurred in cruise between flight levels FL310 and FL380, which I'm pretty sure is 31,000 to 38,000 feet. So, May 2008, literally a year before the accident happened. Because it happened in June, right? I think it was May 31st to June 1st, right? I just read it, but after the Flight 447 accident, Air France identified 6 additional incidents that had not been reported on ASIRS. I don't know what the ASIRS is. I didn't put it in here. ASR. These were intended for maintenance. Okay, that's what ASR is. Reports that are intended for maintenance, plain technical logs. Reports, you get what I mean. Drawn up by pilots to describe incidents only partially, to indicate the characteristic symptoms of the incidents associated with unreliable airspeed readings. So I guess these reports were meant for, like, the plane maintenance people. Or something, that's what it seems like. The problem primarily occurred in 2007 on the A320, but awaiting a recommendation from Airbus, Air France delayed installing new pitot tubes on A330, A340 planes and increased inspection frequencies in these planes. So they did do something. When it was introduced in 1994, the Airbus A330 was equipped with pitot tubes, part number 0851GR. I know it doesn't really matter, but I included it anyway. Manufactured by Goodrich Sensors and Integrated Systems. A 2001 airworthiness directive required these to be replaced with either a later Goodrich design, part number 0851HL, or with pitot tubes made by Thales, part number C16195AA. Air France chose to equip its fleet with the Thales pilot pitot tubes. I can't read anymore. It's too late at night to be reading. In September 2007, Airbus recommended that Thales C16195AA pitot tubes should be replaced by Thales model C16195BA to address the problem of issued by the European Aviation Safety Agency on August 31st and by the FAA on September 3rd. The replacement was to be completed by January 7th, 2010. According to the FAA, in its Federal Register publication, use of the Thales model has resulted in, quote, reports of airspeed indication discrepancies while flying at high altitudes in inclement weather conditions that, quote, could result in reduced control of the airplane. The FAA further stated that the Thales model probe, quote, has not yet demonstrated the same level of robustness to withstand high-altitude ice crystals as Goodrich-Bateau probe's PN0851HL. On December 20th, 2010, Airbus issued a warning to roughly 100 operators of A330, A340-200, and A340-300 planes regarding Bateau tubes, advising pilots not to re-engage the autopilot following failure of the airspeed indicators. Safety recommendations issued by the PEA for Bateau probe design recommended, quote, they must be fitted with a heating system designed to prevent any malfunctioning due to icing. Appropriate means must be provided, visual warning directly visible to the crew, to inform the crew of any non-functioning of the heating system. So, findings from the flight data recorder. On May 27, 2011, the PEA released an update on its investigation describing the history of the flight as recorded by the FDR, which is the flight deck recorder. This confirmed what had previously been concluded from post-mortem examination of the bodies and debris recovered from the ocean surface, which is that the plane had not broken up at altitude, but had fallen into the ocean intact. The FDRs also revealed that the plane's descent into the sea was not due to mechanical failure or the plane being overwhelmed by the weather, but because the flight crew had raised the plane's nose, reducing its speed until it entered an aerodynamic stall and fell out of the sky. While the inconsistent airspeed data caused by the disengagement of the autopilot, the reason the pilots lost control of the plane had remained a mystery, in particular because pilots would normally try to lower the nose in the event of a stall. Multiple sensors provide the pitch information, and no indication was given that any of them were malfunctioning. One factor may be that since the A330 does not normally accept control inputs that would cause a stall, the pilots were unaware that a stall could even happen at all when the plane switched to an alternate mode because of failure of the airspeed indication. In October 2011, a transcript of the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder, was leaked and published in the book Erreurs de pilotage, Pilot Errors, by Jean-Pierre Otelli. The PEA and Air France both condemned the release of this information, with Air France calling it, quote, sensationalized and unverifiable information that impairs the memory of the crew and passengers who lost their lives. The PEA subsequently released its final report on the accident, and Appendix 1 included an official CVR transcript that did not include groups of words deemed to have no bearing on the flight. On July 29, 2011, the PEA released a third interim report on safety issues it found in the wake of the crash. The third interim report stated that some new facts have been established. In particular, the pilots had not applied the unreliable airspeed procedure. The pilot in control pulled back on the stick, thus increasing the angle of attack and causing the plane to climb rapidly. The pilots apparently did not notice that the plane had reached its maximum permissible altitude. The pilots did not read out the available data, vertical velocity, altitude, etc. The stall warning basically, the alarm stopped when they were doing the wrong thing and started when they were doing the right thing. And the final finding was that despite the fact that they were aware that altitude was declining rapidly, the pilots were unable to determine which instruments to trust. All values may have appeared to them to be incoherent. The BEA assembled a human factors working group to analyze the crew's actions and reactions during the final stages of the flight. A brief bulletin by Air France indicated, quote, the misleading stopping and starting of the stall warning alarm, contradicting the actual state of the plane, greatly contributed to the crew's difficulty in analyzing the situation. On July 5th, 2012, the BEA released its final report on the accident. This confirmed the findings of the preliminary reports and provided additional details and recommendations to improve safety. According to the final report, the accident resulted from this succession of major events. Temporary inconsistency between the measured speeds, likely as a result of the obstruction of the pitot tubes by ice crystals, caused the autopilot disconnection and flight control mode reconfiguration to alternate law 2. The crew made inappropriate control inputs that destabilized the flight path. The crew failed to follow appropriate procedure for loss of airspeed information. The crew were late in identifying and correcting the deviation from the flight path. The crew lacked understanding of the approach to stall, of what you're supposed to do when a plane stalls, I guess. The crew failed to recognize the plane had stalled, and consequently did not make inputs that would have made recovering from the stall possible. These events resulted from these major factors in combination. The feedback mechanisms between all those involved. The report identifies manufacturers, operators, flight crews, and regulatory agencies, which made it impossible to identify repeat non-application of the loss of airspeed information procedure, and to ensure that crews were trained in icing of the pitot probes and its consequences. The crew's lack of practical training in manually handling the plane both at high altitude and in the event of anomalies of speed indication. The weakening of the two co-pilots' task sharing, both by incomprehension of the situation at the time of autopilot disconnection, and by poor management of the startle effect, leaving them in an emotionally charged state. The cockpit's lack of a clear display of the inconsistencies in airspeed readings identified by the flight computers. The crew's lack of response to the stall warning, whether due to a failure to identify the audible warning, to the stall warnings going off and on, to the absence of any visual information that could confirm that the plane was approaching stall after losing the characteristic speeds, to confusing stall-related buffet for overspeed-related buffet, to the indications of the flight director that might have confirmed the crew's mistaken view of their actions, or to difficulty in identifying and understanding the implications of the switch to alternate law, which does not protect the angle of attack. So, this is just the Google AI, so I don't know if it's totally right, but apparently what you're supposed to do in the event of loss of airspeed readings is refer to the aircraft manufacturer's provided guidance on pitch and power settings for different flight stages when airspeed information is unavailable. This information can be found in the flight manual or the manufacturer's abnormal procedures manual. Maintain a slight nose-up attitude. If in doubt, maintain a slight nose-up attitude and climb power to keep the aircraft safe. Use standard pitch and power settings. Rely on standard pitch and power settings to descend at a safe speed, which they could have done because they were in the middle of the ocean, but use the sound of the air, because apparently the sound of the air rushing over the cabin can determine that you're flying at a safe speed. I don't know about that. aviation expert from the Flight Safety Laboratory at Brunel University said, quote, "This is an air accident the likes of which we haven't seen before. Half the accident investigators in the Western world, and in Russia too, are waiting for these results. This has been the biggest investigation since Lockerbie." I don't know what Lockerbie is. Put bluntly, big passenger planes do not just fall out of the sky. In a July 2011 article in Aviation Weekly, Sully Sullenberger was quoted as saying the crash was a, quote, seminal accident, and suggested that pilots would be able to better handle upsets of this type if they had an indication of the wing's angle of attack. By contrast, aviation author Captain Bill Palmer has expressed doubts that an angle of attack indicator would have saved Flight 447, writing, "As the pilot flying seemed to be ignoring the more fundamental indicators of pitch and attitude, along with the numerous stall warnings, one could question what difference a rarely used angle of attack gauge would have made." End quote. Following its investigation, the BEA recommended that the European Aviation Safety Agency and the FAA should consider making an angle of attack indicator on the instrument panel mandatory. In 2014, the FAA streamlined requirements for the area of attack indicators for general aviation without affecting requirements for commercial aviation. The final BEA report points to the human-computer interface of the Airbus as a possible factor contributing to the crash. It provides an explanation for most of the pitch-up inputs by the pilot flying. The flight director display was misleading. The pitch-up endpoint at the beginning of the fatal sequence of events appears to be the consequence of an altimeter error. The investigators also pointed to the lack of a clear display of the airspeed inconsistencies, though the computers had identified them. Some systems generated failure messages only about the consequences, but never mentioned the origin of the problem. The investigators recommended a blocked pitot tube should be clearly indicated as such to the crew on the flight displays. The Daily Telegraph pointed out the absence of angle of attack information, which is important in identifying and preventing a stall. The paper stated, though angle of attack readings are sent to onboard computers, there are no displays in modern jets to convey this critical information to the crews. Der Spiegel indicated the difficulty the pilots faced in diagnosing the problem, saying, quote, "One alarm after another lit up in the cockpit monitors, one after another the autopilot, the automatic engine control system, and the flight computers shut themselves off. Against the backdrop of confusing information, difficulty with oral cognition, their hearing in other words, due to the heavy buffeting from the storm as well as the stall, and zero external visibility, the pilots had less than 3 minutes to identify the problem and take corrective action. The Der Spiegel report asserts that such a crash, quote, could happen again." In an article in Vanity Fair, William Langwische, it's a German name, I think, noted that once the angle of attack was so extreme, the system rejected the data as invalid and temporarily stopped the stall warnings, but, quote, "this led to a perverse reversal that lasted nearly to the impact. Each time Bonin happened to lower the nose, rendering the angle of attack marginally less severe, the stall warning sounded again, a negative reinforcement that may have locked him into his pattern of pitching up, which increased the angle of attack and thus aggravated the stall." In April 2012, the Daily Telegraph, British journalist Nick Ross published a comparison of Airbus and Boeing flight controls. Unlike the control yoke used on Boeing flight decks, the Airbus side stick controls give little visual feedback and no sensory or tactile feedback to the second pilot. The cockpit synthetic voice, however, does give an oral message dual input whenever inputs are initiated by the pilots. Ross reasoned that this might in part explain why the pilot flying's fatal nose-up inputs were not countermanded by his two colleagues. In a July 12th CBS report, Sully Sullenberger suggested the design of the Airbus cockpit might have been a factor in the accident. The flight controls are not mechanically linked between the two pilot seats, and Robert, the left seat pilot who believed he had taken control of the plane, was not aware that Bonin continued to hold the stick back, which overrode Robert's own control. seems kind of basic to me. Like, why were they not connected? The PEA final report acknowledged the difficulty for one pilot to observe the side stick input of the other, but did not identify it as a cause of the accident, and made no recommendation related to the side stick input design. Another factor that might have caused the crash was fatigue, because getting enough sleep is a constant concern for pilots of long-haul flights. Although the PEA could find no objective indications that the pilots of Flight 447 were suffering from fatigue, some exchanges recorded on the cockpit voice recorder, including a remark made by Captain Dubois that he had only slept an hour, could indicate the crew were not well rested before the flight. The co-pilots had spent 3 nights in Rio, but the PEA was unable to retrieve data regarding their rest and couldn't determine the activities that they engaged in during the stopover. Shortly after the crash, Air France changed the number of the regular Rio-Paris flight from AF447 to AF445. However, as of December 2023, the number for the route has been changed to AF485, and instead of an Airbus A330, the airline uses a Boeing 777-300ER. As of January 2024, Air France is beginning to phase out their entire Airbus A330 fleet to be replaced by newer and more energy-efficient Airbus A350-900s, and they are all to be completely retired by 2030. Just making up words now. Several cases have occurred where inaccurate airspeed information led to flight incidents on the A330 and A340, 2 of which involved Pitot probes. In the first incident, in Air France A340-300, which was flight FGLCL, en route from Tokyo to Paris, experienced an event at 31,000 feet in which the airspeed was incorrectly reported and the autopilot automatically disengaged. So the same thing that happened at Flight 447. Bad weather and obstructed drainage holes in all 3 Pitot probes were found to be the cause. In the second incident in Air France A340-300, which was flight FGLCN en route from Paris to New York, encountered turbulence followed by the auto-flight systems going offline, warnings over the accuracy of the reported airspeed, and 2 minutes of stall alerts. Though it seems like neither of those planes crashed, because it doesn't say that they crashed, so I guess they recovered. Another incident on TAM flight 8091 from Miami to Rio on May 21st, 2009, involving an A330-200, showed a sudden drop of outside air temperature, then loss of air data. The ADIRS autopilot and autothrust. The plane descended 3,300 feet before being manually recovered using backup instruments. The NTSB also examined a similar June 23rd, 2009 incident on a Northwest Airlines flight from Hong Kong to Tokyo, concluding in both cases that the plane operating manual was sufficient to prevent a dangerous situation from happening, which ended up not being the case. Following the crash of Air France Flight 447, other Airbus A330 operators studied their internal flight records to seek patterns. Delta Airlines analyzed the data of Northwest Airlines flights that occurred before the 2 companies merged and found a dozen incidents in which at least one of an A330's pitot tubes had briefly stopped working when the plane was flying through the ITCC, the same location where Air France 447 crashed. Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501, a 2014 fatal crash involving an Airbus A320 resulting from a high-altitude stall and pilots making opposite inputs with the plane's side stick controls. So these are similar crashes that happened. Colgan Air Flight 3407, a 2009 fatal crash, resulted from improper response to a stall by the pilot. Bergen Air Flight 301 was a 1996 fatal crash resulting from blocked pitot British Airlines Flight 5904, another flight that crashed because pilots improperly handled improper airspeed information due to frozen pitot tubes. And finally, TWA Flight 841 in 1979, and China Airlines Flight 006, which are other accidents in which pilot errors led to stalls. So, that's the end of that. This was a long one. My script is 19 pages long. I hope that was entertaining. I know the actual, drama of the plane crash was over pretty quickly, but I do find plane crashes to be pretty interesting, because, I don't know, flying itself is just such a crazy thing, you know? And when I first read this case, I feel kind of bad, but I was really just sitting there what were these pilots doing? What were they thinking? They were doing the opposite of what they should have been doing. But after reading, the results of the investigation, and, considering what, their headspace might have been at the time, because it's easy to read, they did this when they should have done that, and think, well, why? They were experienced pilots, why did they fuck up so badly? But, it's not like they wanted to crash their plane. It's not like they wanted to die. I'm sure that pilot didn't want his wife to die. So, you just gotta have empathy for the people in the situation. And it is crazy too, because that whole accident took 3 minutes. I can't imagine what it must have felt like on that plane, rolling back and forth side to side and descending at a high altitude, or descending at a high, rapidness. You know what I'm trying to say? High speed. It must have been really scary for all the passengers and for the pilots too, because they just didn't even know what to do anymore, So, yeah. If you watched this long, let me know down in the comments if I should do more videos like this.